Good morning, everyone, or I said good afternoon, I guess it's at noon. My name is Heather Bacher, and I am the coordinator for the Women for the Land program. We're your hosts today. Women for the Land is a group of conservation professionals associated with the Indiana Conservation Partners. That's a number of conservation-based agencies and organizations in the state. And our goal for Hoosier Women is to bring to them information, education about conservation practices that they can bring to their farms, their gardens, their communities. So we often do programming for women, but we have begun also sharing some of our discussions with everyone. So we're happy to have fellows on this call as well. And speaking of fellas, I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenter today. And Mitch, I'm going to let you introduce yourself if you wouldn't mind, and get us started. I will say before I do that, this will be conversational. Mitch will be doing his presentation, but we'll have a chance to talk and ask questions, and I will be monitoring the chat as we go. If anyone has any technical issues or questions about Zoom or needs any help, please feel free to include that in the chat, and we'll get started. So, Mitch.
Great. Well, thanks for having me today. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to present this 4-part series on pond management. So let me just share my screen here, and then we'll get started. Yeah, so Heather contacted me a little while ago and asked if I'd be interested in presenting this, and I'm excited to be here. And I've been working in the pond management space for a few years now for Purdue Extension, and we're really developing a lot of products and tools to help landowners, and some of the things we've developed really fit nicely into this 4-part series. And so, like I said, I'm excited to be presenting this and having a conversation with you about all things pond management, and it really ties in nicely to some of the stuff that I've been doing over the past couple of years. So I'm a clinical assistant professor at Purdue. I'm based in West Lafayette. My role there is I do a lot of teaching, and then I also do a lot of extension. And so I'm also an extension specialist, and I have 2 main programs there. One of them focuses on pond management in the Midwest, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And then the other program I work on too is fisheries, recreational fisheries up in Lake Michigan. So if you're interested in that sort of stuff, we can connect and talk more about that. But today I'm going to be focusing on some of the pond management programming that I've developed, and starting this conversation about how to sustainably manage a pond and understanding the different components of a pond, so that you can consider a pond more as this sort of complex ecosystem rather than just a hole in the ground that we throw chemicals into occasionally. So if you have questions or want to follow up after this, or any time throughout the series or after this series finishes, please reach out to me via my email. And that's the best way to get in touch with me. I'm happy to answer one-on-one questions with you about your pond, or if you have other questions, I can forward those on to experts in sort of my contact list. So I've started working on pond management stuff a few years ago. You might be able to tell that I have a bit of an accent. I'm not from the Midwest originally. I'm from Australia. I've been at Purdue for 7 years. I've been working on pond management stuff for probably 3 or 4 years now. My background is marine biology, actually, and I still teach a lot in marine biology, and I know a lot about ocean fisheries, and I've been learning as much as I can over the past 3 or so years on ponds, and come to realize how valuable ponds are to landowners, and how they're a great place to spend time. I've done a lot of fishing in ponds since I've been here, and I'm really excited to develop tools and information that can help people manage their ponds more effectively. Some of the things that we've developed, and I know these were shared before the session, but sort of the one-stop shop if you're interested in pond management and the programming that I do at Purdue is our extension website. So I've partnered with someone who works with wildlife and also works a lot with landowners on managing their property for wildlife. And we've developed a website. You can see a screenshot of it here. It's basically extension.purdue.edu/pondwildlife. And we have all of the products we're developing and all of the information we're generating. It can be found at this website. And so you basically click on whether you're interested in ponds or interested in wildlife habitat. And you'll get taken to different pages, some of our publications. We have a find your county contact page where you can find the locals in your county who can help you with stuff. And so on the pond management side, I've been producing a bunch of these publications. So you can see there's one here on managing fish populations, and I'm going to talk about that in one of our future conversations. I also have publications on fish stocking, fish identification. We're going to have some coming out on aquatic plant management and ID here pretty soon. And then over the past 12 months, I've been also working on a podcast. So we have a podcast called Pond University, and it's part of a larger network on all sorts of things that are relevant to landowners. And so if you haven't checked that out already, you can find those through our website, or we also have our individual websites for those podcasts. And so, hopefully you're familiar with what we're going to be doing in this series. This was on the flyer that was sent around. And so this is a 4-part series where we're going to be diving into ponds. These are predominantly targeting, rural ponds on your properties, but it's also relevant to, stormwater retention ponds, homeowners association ponds, housing development ponds, all those sorts of things. But a lot of what we do really focuses on the individual landowners that might have ponds on their rural properties. And so we're going to start things today by looking at the pond ecosystem. I really like to say that it's more than just a puddle in the ground. And it might be easier to think it's pretty simple. If you've got a 1/4 acre pond, you might not think it's that complex, but there are lots of things that are happening in the pond. And I like to talk about these ecosystems because understanding these ecosystems better can really help inform your management. And so, as we step through this series, we're going to be talking about some specific managements for fish and for vegetation and things like that. And I really try and promote this idea of, an ecosystem-based approach to management. You can throw chemicals in there and that's going to treat one thing, but how does that impact the rest of the ecosystem? And by understanding some of these components, you might be able to tailor your management and have more effective management down the road. And the goal here for this first webinar today is to really provide some information on ecosystems and the interactions that happen there, so that you can have sustainable management. You can help conservation on your land, but more importantly, a lot of understanding these techniques can help save you money. If you're doing things like adding chemicals to treat vegetation, that gets expensive year after year after year. And by looking at some of the drivers of why that vegetation's there in the first place, you might be able to save a lot of money by changing some of those things. All right. I think, as we move along, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. This presentation should probably take no more than 30 minutes. So we can wait and have a conversation after that, or you can put questions in the chat as we go along so that you don't forget them. Or if you want to interrupt me, we can chat now too. I'm pretty flexible. But this is just a bit of information. You might be familiar with some of this stuff, but really this is just to promote the conversation we're going to have at the end of the presentation. So like I've said a couple times already, ponds are more complex than you'd think. There are lots of things happening in ponds. They have abiotic factors, which you might also think of as non-living things. So this is typically things like water chemistry, the type of nutrients in the pond, the sediment in your pond, and the color of the pond, all sorts of things like that. And those things are really important to consider, and it can really have a lot of impact on the things that live in there and the type of management that you do in your pond. The next sort of group of things in the pond are biotic characters. And so these are the living things in your pond, starting all the way down with microscopic organisms like viruses and bacteria, moving all the way through all the different animals you might think of, up to mammals and birds that spend time in your pond as well. And then a couple of other things that are part of this ecosystem too are the interactions. So, things eat other things. And so there are interactions that we're interested in. Sometimes temperature, oxygen will impact the living characteristics like the fish. And then humans are an important part of that ecosystem too. We use the pond, we want to, potentially take things out. We want to catch fish and remove them from the ponds. We want to swim in the pond. And we also do things to the pond. We might do things on the land that influence the pond. We might add things to the pond to improve its management. So that's sort of what I'm talking about when I talk about the pond ecosystem. It's everything from the temperature of the water all the way through to what people are doing in and around the pond. So I'm going to start by talking about some of these non-living characteristics, or what we call abiotic characteristics. So you might be familiar with some of these, and you might be aware of how they influence your pond already. But these are actually really important characteristics in your pond. Some of these you can't control much. Some of them you can by changing things on the land. But the important thing here is pretty much all of these non-living factors will influence living factors in your pond, things like plants, fish, the food that fish eat. And so it's really important to understand some of these characteristics and to really understand what they look like in your pond. And in our podcast, we've covered quite a few episodes looking at some of these characteristics and how you might be able to measure those and stuff like that in your pond. And then some of these characteristics will sort of work together to create these important processes. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these non-living processes as well. So things like sedimentation, stratification and turnover, which you might have heard of before, and how that can lead to fish kills in some situations as well. So I'm going to step through some of these different things before we move on to looking at some of the living characteristics in a pond. So the first, I guess, non-living component I want to talk about is sunlight. So sunlight is really important in ponds primarily because it drives photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is what plants need to do to grow and survive. And so sunlight drives that. But photosynthesis is really important in ponds because it adds oxygen to our pond as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. But sunlight, without sunlight, plants can't photosynthesize. So sunlight's important for that. Sunlight's also important because it warms the water, and some ponds can vary a lot in their water temperature. Shallow, turbid ponds or more muddy ponds can get really, really hot. Deeper, clearer ponds get nowhere near as hot in the summertime, and so the water temperature is variable between seasons, between night and day, and temperature really, sunlight and temperature, and we'll talk about temperature more in a minute, but that really influences a lot of the things that live in the ponds as well. And then one of the biggest considerations with sunlight is sunlight doesn't penetrate through the water column all the same. So the color of the water and the things that are suspended in the water influences how much sunlight gets through. And so if you have a clear pond, obviously the sunlight can penetrate further, and you might get plants growing down 15, 20 feet in your pond. If you have a muddy pond, you might not get plants growing at all, or you might only get plants growing down to a couple of feet in the water column. And so, sunlight is linked to water clarity. And because of that, if you have problems with clear water and excessive plants growing, you can actually add dyes to your water that can help manage and help prevent that sunlight penetrating and manage some of that plant growth. The second sort of abiotic characteristic that's important to think about are nutrients. I'm sure you've all heard about nutrients before, and nutrients are really important in ponds. It drives a lot of the problems we see in ponds, and it also drives the productivity of the pond. And so, I assume that most of you are in the Midwest, if not in Indiana itself. And in the Midwest, we're lucky to some extent in that our ponds are naturally high in nutrients. This is because we have hard water, and that really promotes the nutrients entering the pond and those nutrients being utilized by things in the pond. So 99% of the ponds that I see in the Midwest have high nutrients. And this is great because nutrients are what fuels the food web in the pond. And so if you're interested in growing big fish or lots of fish to catch and eat, or even having a very healthy pond with some aquatic vegetation and things like that, all of those things require nutrients coming into that pond. And we're lucky in the Midwest in that we have high nutrients already. And so we can often grow more fish in our ponds. We can grow fish to larger sizes in some cases. This is in contrast to ponds in the South. And if you've ever looked at any pond management literature and you've read things that are from the South, you'll see that they have soft water, and so their ponds have low nutrient levels. And in a lot of cases, they need to fertilize their ponds so that they get more production in their ponds. And you definitely don't want to do that in most cases in the Midwest, because that'll just add to some of your problems with plants and algae. But nutrients, the main nutrients that we're interested in aquatic systems, whether it be in ponds or even in the ocean, is nitrogen and phosphorus. They're the two nutrients that tend to be limiting when it comes to production and growth. In freshwater systems like ponds, it tends to be phosphorus that's most limiting. And because of that, when you get inputs of lots of phosphorus, then that's when you can get lots of plant growth and things like that. So the nutrients enter the pond typically through runoff from the land. Definitely some enter through leaching from the sediments, and when things die in the pond, they add new nutrients to the pond. But most of the nutrients that come into the pond enter through runoff. This can be when rain washes across your crops or your lawn or anything like that. It'll take nutrients with it and dump those into the pond. And snowmelt does the same thing. Irrigation will do the same thing. So if your pond has a really large watershed, the area of land that the water flows in, then you're going to get more nutrients into your pond than if your pond doesn't have a very large watershed at all. So nutrients, drive this growth and production, like I mentioned. But in a lot of cases, particularly here in the Midwest, we end up with too many nutrients. We get cloudy water, we get lots and lots of plant growth, and that can become a problem for fish, but it can also be a problem for us using the pond. We might want to swim in it or even fish in it, and it's just choked out with vegetation. And a lot of this is driven by high nutrients. And so, in the future, when we start talking about managing for plants and managing for various things in the pond, one of the best ways to do that is to try and prevent some of these nutrients entering. Prevention can often be much less expensive and much more effective than treatment after you've already got some of these algal blooms and things like that. The third characteristic I want to talk about that's linked a little bit to nutrients and sunlight is dissolved oxygen. So everything that's living in a pond needs oxygen, just like we need oxygen. But things that live in the water get their oxygen from the water itself. So the oxygen gets dissolved in the water, and then they can breathe that oxygen out of the water. Most dissolved oxygen in water, including a pond, comes from plants. So I said, plants use the sunlight to get energy through photosynthesis. One of the byproducts of that is oxygen, and that oxygen is dissolved in the water. And so I think, at least 80% of the oxygen we have in our ponds typically comes from the plants that are growing in there. So plants are really beneficial in our ponds for lots of different reasons, but one of them is adding oxygen. We do get some oxygen in our ponds from the surface of the water, so the oxygen in the air will sort of diffuse into the water. But this very surface layer of the pond is a very small part of the whole water body, and so that tends not to be too much. You can add things like aerators to a pond to help increase some of that dissolved oxygen in the pond. But both of these things are pretty small when you compare it to the oxygen we get from plants. And the one thing, see if I can, my menu bar's covered up my slide. Here we go. So the one thing to think about is that oxygen is linked to temperature of your water. And so the warmer your water is in your pond, the less oxygen that water can hold. This is typically not a problem if you have, if you have well-mixed ponds. Even if it gets up to 80 or even 90 degrees, it will hold less water than it will hold less oxygen than cold water, but it's still generally will have enough oxygen for fish. It's only once we start to get separation and stratification in the pond that you can lose oxygen, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So this is just a diagram that we've put together that talks a little bit about how photosynthesis works. And so basically, you might remember this from some of your biology classes, but basically in the daytime, sunlight enters your pond. The plants use that sunlight combined with nutrients to create energy for themselves. they release oxygen, which is great, and they use carbon dioxide, which is also good in the water. The one thing about photosynthesis is it doesn't happen when there's no sunlight. So if you get, so at night when there's no sun, or even during the day when you've got a really cloudy day, there's very little sunlight entering the pond. And so what happens then is plants, instead of producing oxygen, will actually start to use oxygen. So they start to breathe just like everything else. So they use the oxygen and then they release carbon dioxide, the same as what we do when we breathe. And so ponds that have really high amounts of vegetation will often get these big swings in oxygen. So in the daytime, they get really high oxygen because the plants are producing a lot of oxygen. But then at night, that production stops and then the plants start using a lot of that oxygen. And so you get these big swings in oxygen from day to night. Okay, a couple of the other abiotic characteristics I want to touch on now, temperature and turbidity and a few things like that. But temperature is a really interesting variable in water because it's sort of considered the master variable. And what that means is it basically, it's linked to a lot of other things and it drives a lot of what's happening in your pond. And so I've already mentioned that temperature influences oxygen. Warm water holds less oxygen than cold water. Temperature also influences the pH in your pond. pH will go up and down through the day because of changes in temperature. But temperature also influences a lot of the living factors in your pond. And so typically plant growth and fish growth is slower when it's cold and and faster when it's warm. So your fish don't grow very fast in the wintertime. They also don't move around very much. And the same with plants, you don't get much plant growth through the winter. A lot of plants will die off in the wintertime. And then as the pond warms up in the spring, you get certain plants growing at certain temperature windows. So you'll get certain types of algae will come in the spring. Some submersed plants prefer cooler water in the spring. And then in the summer, you'll get a different type of plants as well. And, temperature is really influenced by a couple of things. So, we can't, apart from, putting a giant hat over the pond, we can't really do too much about temperature. But if you have a shallow pond, a shallow, small pond, these are going to warm up a lot faster than a deep pond and a deep, large pond. And so, and this is also true for if your pond is murky, that is going to heat up faster than if you have a clear pond. But then temperature can also vary with what happens around the pond as well. So if it's the springtime and your pond is still relatively cool, but you get a warm, spring rainfall event, then your pond gets all that warm rain coming into it. It can warm up really quickly. And on the flip side, in the fall, your pond might be pretty warm still, but you get a cold rain, it can decrease that temperature. Other things that change temperature are things like shade. And so if you have a lot of plants growing on the surface, you have a lot of trees around your pond, that offers a lot of shade and can really reduce the temperature and provide some important shade for things that live in the pond, particularly in the summertime. So I've mentioned turbidity a couple of times. Turbidity or murkiness really is basically just the color of the water. And it's caused by a few different things. So most turbidity is caused by suspended sediments. This could be soil, silt, clay. These are tiny particles that get suspended in the water column and cause that pond to look muddy. Some of these will settle out, particularly if they're larger particles, but if they're really, really fine particles, they may stay suspended in your pond for a long time. Other things that cause turbidity are tannins and various things like that leaching from leaves or trees. And then also if you get a phytoplankton bloom in your pond, it can cause it to look like a green soup, which also contributes to that turbidity. Most turbidity things are linked to land use practices. So if you've got, if you till your fields and then you don't have you don't have plants to trap a lot of that soil, if you get a rainfall event, a lot of that soil can end up in your pond. It can also be linked to things like if you have livestock using your pond, they can sort of disturb the sediments and cause turbidity and things like that. Turbidity is a bit of a mixed bag, whether we want it or not in our ponds. So some people think that a really clear pond is great and it can be great for a lot of things. But if you have some turbidity, particularly if it's a plankton bloom, so you get this sort of greeny brown colored water, that's just an indication that your pond is really productive. You have nutrients coming in and that phytoplankton is growing. And so that can actually allow you to grow a lot of fish and other things in your pond if it doesn't get too bad. But if your pond is muddy from sediments, then that can cause your pond to heat up faster, and it can also prevent light from entering and allowing plants to grow. Turbidity is linked to a couple of different things, but it's not always bad. And if you do have, suspended sediments or clay or other things in your pond, there are things that you can do to help manage that and reduce some of that turbidity in your pond. And the last abiotic characteristic I want to mention quickly is pH, because I get quite a lot of questions about pH. So pH is basically just a measure of how acidic or how basic your water is. So a pH value of 7 indicates neutral water, so it's not acidic or basic. Most ponds, particularly in the Midwest, are a little higher than that. So they're around 8, 8.5. And this means that they're slightly basic or slightly alkaline. And this has to do with the dissolved minerals in the water, which also makes that water hard. If your water is less than 7, it means it's acidic. From a fish perspective, fish can tolerate a pretty wide range of pH. So, anywhere from like 5 to 10 is usually fine for fish. And so pH is not usually a big problem in ponds. You can test your pH really easily. You can get test strips from anywhere, from pool places or fish, stores, or even Amazon, stuff like that. And you can test your pH pretty easily. pH does vary a lot during the day as well. And so if you are testing it, you might want to test it a few different times throughout the day. The only consideration really for pH is that if your pH is really high or really low, it can influence what sort of chemicals you use in your pond. But if it's between 6 and 9, which most Midwestern ponds are, you don't really need to consider pH too much in your pond management. Okay, the last couple of things I want to talk about with regards to abiotic factors are some of these abiotic processes that happen in a pond. And these processes are really important for managing your pond, for fish and stuff like that, and can help indicate, some other problems you might be having in your pond. So the first is sedimentation, and this is pretty much what it sounds like. It's basically sediment entering your pond and over time filling up your pond. And so this is bad because it causes your pond to be muddy, but it also causes your pond to get shallower and shallower. And we know that shallow ponds will fluctuate more with temperature and things like that. But also the shallower your pond, the more opportunity there is for plants to grow. And so often people who have lots of issues with plants and vegetation in their pond, it's because they have this sedimentation that has caused their pond to become shallow. So this happens over time as sediment runs into your pond. And it really varies. People ask me, how long does sedimentation take? And it varies on the size and shape of your pond, and it also varies on what's happening on the land. Sometimes, ponds can get, 2-3 feet of sediment in them only after 5 or 6 years, but sometimes it can take 20 or 30 years, depending on what your pond is like. And we recorded a podcast recently where, the guest said that, in at least half of pond issues, whether it's fish kills or too much vegetation or anything like that, a lot of the time the main culprit is sedimentation, and so dealing with your sedimentation can help solve some of your other issues that you're having. The other thing with sedimentation is, as those sediment particles enter your pond, they can bring things with them. So they often bring nutrients attached to the particles, and they can also bring pollutants into your pond as well. And so sometimes that can cause some other issues. And the best way to prevent sedimentation is to have a buffer strip around your pond. And this basically means, having some vegetation on land around your pond that can trap a lot of that sediment before it gets into your pond. These buffer strips are also great for trapping excessive nutrients. And so, if you currently mow all the way up to the edge of your pond, you might want to leave, 10 feet of grass growing there so that it traps a lot of this sediment and a lot of that nutrients. Okay, so I want to also talk a little bit about stratification and pond turnover. And I have some diagrams on the next slide that'll help explain this a little bit more. But if you haven't heard of this already, stratification is basically when you get distinct layers in your pond. And so this happens because ponds at different temperature have different, water at different temperature has different density. So the most dense water is actually 39 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's cooler than this, so 34 or even ice, it floats on top of that. And so that's why if you put ice in your glass, it floats, it doesn't sink. Then any water that's warmer than 39 degrees also sits on top because it's less dense. And so what happens is, in the spring and the fall where the water is changing temperature a lot and there's, it's mixing around, your pond is basically well mixed. But in the summertime and also in the winter, what happens is, let's just take the summertime, for example, your surface of your pond warms up. And then as it warms, it gets less dense and it stays at the top of the pond. And it creates sort of a cap on the pond. And then that continues to warm, and that separates from the water underneath, which stays cold. And the longer that, when you get really warm weather and really calm weather, this stratification can get really strong, where it's like, 85 degrees at the surface, but it might still only be 50 degrees at the bottom of your pond. The same thing happens in winter, except it's ice on top rather than that warm water. And then what happens is, either in the spring or the fall, when the temperature starts to equalize, that pond will mix and turn over. Or if, in the summertime, you get a really large thunderstorm, the wind can cause that pond to mix up. Stratification is natural and this turnover is natural. But what happens sometimes is if you get that stratification persisting for a long period of time, the water at the bottom starts to get devoid of oxygen because it can't exchange oxygen with the surface. You have bacteria down there that's using up a lot of oxygen. And so that band of water at the bottom can get low in oxygen. Then what happens is if that pond mixes, that low oxygen goes everywhere and can actually start to kill off your fish. And I'll show you a diagram here that sort of shows that in a bit more detail. But like I said, stratification is natural. But if you find that you have problems with stratification and you're having frequent fish kills, you might be able to help manage some of this with an aerator. And the best aerators are those bottom diffusion aerators. So that's where you have an air stone on the bottom of your pond and it bubbles up to the surface and helps keep that water mixing around to prevent that stratification. So this is just a diagram that shows summer stratification and summer fish kill. So like I said, you basically get this setup where you get warm water at the surface, cold water at the bottom, and you get these layers that don't mix together. At the bottom, you get bacteria breaking down plants and dead animals, and so they use up all the oxygen. So the living fish get out of there because there's no oxygen for them, so they sort of squeeze into this top part of the pond. As that summer progresses, that bottom layer gets larger, and so more and more of the pond has no oxygen in it. And while the pond's not mixing, that's still okay because the fish can sort of stay up in this upper area where there's good oxygen. Then if you get a storm or something else, or even in the fall, naturally you get this mixing. What happens is if this low dissolved oxygen layer is really large, when it mixes with the rest of the pond, it brings the oxygen down so low that it can cause fish to die. And so this is what happens if you get a fish kill in the summertime. This is the process that it's gone through. And so if you have an aerator in your pond, basically what happens is it prevents these layers from establishing in the first place. It keeps that pond mixing and it keeps that pond well oxygenated. So that's how the aerators can prevent those fish kills. So the same sort of thing happens in the wintertime. Like I said, it's basically just ice forming a cap now instead of that warm water. And then what happens when that ice forms is that the plants start to die, particularly if there's snow on the ice. Those plants in there will die off. Bacteria will start to decompose those plants, use up the oxygen. And if that snow and ice sits there for a couple of months, maybe, then your whole pond can basically can lose its oxygen. And that's what leads to a winter fish kill. And these can sometimes be tricky to diagnose because your pond's frozen over, you don't really see anything. The fish don't float because it's frozen. Then in the summertime, or in the spring, you start to go fishing and you don't catch any fish. And you wonder where your fish have all gone. And typically what's happened is you've had a winter kill that you didn't see because it was frozen. And then you now have, low fish populations and you may need to look at restocking fish or something like that. Okay, I'm about to jump into the living factors now, so things like plants and fish and other things like that. I wasn't sure, Heather, do you think I should stop and address some questions before I move on, or?
Yeah, that's great. And I'm sorry I didn't ask you that earlier.
Oh, no problem.
If you prefer to answer questions as we go, if they're natural breaking spots, that would be great.
Yeah, this is a good one because, that was a lot of information, and I'm sure people could use use a bit of a break from more lecturing here for a minute. So I'm happy to answer some questions about some of these abiotic processes.
Well, great. Well, Mandy's asking, how many aerators do you recommend for a 2 to 3 acre pond?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a common question I get a lot. And it's hard to put an exact number because, like I said, it depends on your pond, the depth of your pond and the shape of your pond and things like that. But if you've got a relatively shallow pond that doesn't have a lot of refuge for fish in the summertime, down deeper in the water and things like that, you might, typically people recommend maybe 2 aerators per acre, as long as you've got a large enough sort of pump to drive that. And so, basically, if you have no aerators at the moment and you're experiencing some of these problems, basically what you could do is you could add a couple to one section of your pond, and that will at least keep, that section of your pond, mixed. And that may be enough refuge to prevent, some of the issues you're having. And if that doesn't work, in a year or two, you might want to add a couple of more, because some of these aerators can, they can get a bit expensive to put in. And so I don't want to say, go out and put six of them in your pond when you may only need 2, so, but that would be my recommendation, is start with a couple in, and, keep them, don't sort of spread them out through the whole pond. Maybe put them in a 1 acre area. If you've got, a bit of a cove or a bay or something, you can put them in and then see how that affects some of your problems.
Great. And then Jessica asks, she's with the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. Being a North urban biologist, I talk a lot about habitat around ponds and urban areas. Can you talk about the benefits of native vegetation around ponds, including root depth for water filtration, slowing the flow of water into the pond, shoreline stabilization, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So, shoreline vegetation is really wonderful for ponds. And, some people, in a lot of cases, people will either let the shoreline vegetation grow naturally, if it's in a rural setting, or if they've been cutting it or treating it, they might just allow it to come back. But sometimes in urban settings, or even in new pond constructions, you might need to plant, some vegetation as well. And, I haven't done any of that planting myself, but I can definitely find resources in terms of what plant species are better than others. But honestly, any sort of vegetation along the shoreline that has some sort of substantial root system will work well. And so this could be a mix of bushes, trees, and grasses. So grasses can be really great because, there's a lot of them and they have a pretty complex root system under the ground. And then, trees are great because they provide some shading and stuff like that. But yeah, plants are great for all the reasons that I've mentioned already. They help trap sediment coming in. They help trap excessive nutrients coming in. They stabilize the shoreline so you don't get erosion. The only downside to some of these buffer strip areas is that they may prevent some of your access to that part of the pond. And that's one of the big concerns that a lot of landowners have, is that they want to be able to walk around their pond and fish and swim, and they don't want to have, grass and shrubs all around their pond so that they can't get in. And so usually what I tell people is, if there are certain parts of your pond where most of that water's coming in, say you've got a little gully or a little creek that runs in or something like that, that's where you could sort of allow a lot of that vegetation to establish. And then other areas that don't see a lot of water flowing in, you could clear for swimming areas or fishing and stuff like that.
Great, thank you. And also, Sarah is interested in resources on riparian plantings, and Jessica responded with a link to biologists around the state that can help with management plants and that kind of thing. So we'll provide those, some of that information in a follow-up email to you all. But also, before we move on, Tim asks, is duckweed good for oxygen?
Good question. So, so that's a question. I get similar questions like that as well, because, for those that don't know, duckweed is a small plant that floats on the surface, and the same, so not the entire plant is not in the water, right? It's just sort of the bottom of the leaf that's sitting on the water surface. So they don't add as much oxygen to the water as completely submerged plants. The same goes for emergent plants like cattails or water willow. So any part of the plant that's not in the water will release oxygen to the air. Any part of the plant that's in the water will release oxygen into the water. So duckweed doesn't add as much oxygen as pondweeds or even algae that's in the water. The one thing that, duckweed can be a big problem because it can, cover your whole pond. It can shade out the system and allow other plants to die off. But if duckweed is only in certain parts of your pond, it can be important for shading and keeping some of that water temperature down and stuff like that. But in terms of oxygen, it doesn't add as much because it's simply not submersed under the water.
I think Jessica made the observation, duckweed is native, but it's beneficial for ducks, but can be hard to manage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I think we can go ahead and move on.
Great.
Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about the living parts of the pond now. So we've got a pretty good understanding of what some of these non-living things are, and we could talk about those in a lot more detail, or you can send questions in. But we're going to link to a lot of this stuff as we move through this series when we get more into sort of management. But when you're thinking about the living parts of your pond, a lot of people think about fish for sure, maybe some of the things that fish eat. But there's actually a lot more things that are living in your pond than you might think. And so, we're going to look at some of the microbes in ponds, so things like bacteria, viruses. We'll look at some primary producers. So these are anything that produces their own energy, so pretty much plants. Then we'll look at consumers. Ponds have lots of different types of consumers. They have primary consumers like insects, and they have high-level consumers like fish and mammals. And then we'll also look at some of the things that help recycle energy in our pond, so detritivores and decomposers. And then we're also going to look at the interactions between some of these living things. And so predation is really important in ponds, and it's one of the main ways that we can manage fish in our pond. We'll also look at competition, and I'll talk a little bit about habitat as well. So pond microbes typically consisted of viruses, which are the smallest ones, bacteria, which are a little larger, and then fungi. We also have some microscopic fungi in our ponds. And most of these microbes you don't see, you might never think about, but they're really important for breaking down dead organic matter in our pond. So anything that dies, well, most of the things that die in our pond, plants, fish, other things, they sink to the bottom and they get broken down by bacteria. And so as those bacteria break down that organic matter, they use oxygen. So that's why sometimes ponds will get low dissolved oxygen near the bottom. But what they do is they recycle the energy in that matter, right? So you take the energy into their body, and then things like worms or other invertebrates will eat the bacteria, and then they'll essentially recycle that energy back up into the food web. So that's really one of their main roles in a pond. Some of these can be parasitic and can cause disease. So, viruses, bacteria, they can be parasitic and cause disease in our fish. We don't see that too much in ponds. You really only get problems with disease when you have really, really high numbers of fish. And so you get this more in like aquaculture settings than you do in natural ponds. One type of microbe that you might have heard of, might be familiar with, is actually blue-green algae. So blue-green algae, what the common name says it's an algae, is actually a type of bacteria. It's cyanobacteria. This is what it looks like when it's on your pond. It floats. So there's some parts of its structure allow it to float. It's got this really green, this sort of blue-green color. And cyanobacteria are a really interesting group of bacteria because they do lots of good things in our pond. They they're one of the plants that will help fix nitrogen. So nitrogen is a byproduct of things that happen in the pond, and they can help fix it so that it can be used again by plants. But cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, some species of them can actually release toxins. And that's really one of the key problems that cyanobacteria causes in ponds. And not all species release toxins. And I've learned recently that even those that do release toxins don't always release toxins. So it's still pretty unknown why they release them sometimes and not others. But if you see any cyanobacteria, blue-green algae in your pond, then it's important for you to get that water tested for toxins and to keep an eye on that, because these toxins are harmful to people, they're harmful to pets, they can kill your dogs. And so you definitely don't want to be drinking the water, swimming in the water, or really even handling fish that you catch out of the water if you have blooms of blue-green algae. And so, yeah, if you do have a bloom like this, or even a small bloom, you definitely want to get your water tested, reach out to a professional, and keep an eye on those toxin levels. And then once they go away, then you can start to use your pond again. So the next group of living organisms in our pond are the primary producers. And so these are things that photosynthesize. They use energy from the sun, combine that with nutrients to create energy for themselves. And this is anything from phytoplankton. So this is a microscopic image of phytoplankton over here. There's, thousands of species. This is just an example of one. But what you'll probably see if you have a bloom of phytoplankton is you'll get this sort of pea soup color water here. So this is indicating that you've got a bloom of phytoplankton and your water has turned this green color. Phytoplankton are incredibly important because they're really the base of the food web. There are some things that eat dead animals and dead plants, but most things in a pond will want to eat this phytoplankton to begin with. And so, that's why these Midwestern ponds are really great for growing fish, because we have these high level of nutrients and we often get these blooms of phytoplankton. Other types of primary producers are submersed vegetations, filamentous algae. I'm sure you're familiar with some of those because they cause problems in ponds sometimes. Floating plants like duckweed, which is mentioned, and then we get these emergent plants which grow around the shoreline like cattails. Overall, these primary producers probably add 80 to 90% of the oxygen that you get in your pond. So that's really important. Like I said, the phytoplankton in particular forms the base of the food web. And some of these larger plants and even algae will provide important habitats. So insects live in there, small fish eat the insects, and then these large fish use these areas for hunting their prey as well. So there are lots of benefits of these primary producers, but sometimes they get overgrown and can start to choke out an area, and that's where we might need some preventative or even some reactive management to get rid of them. So the next group of organisms are the consumers. So these are things that, unlike plants, they can't produce their own energy. They have to eat other things to get their energy. And so this starts with primary consumers. So we call primary consumers primary because they're sort of the first step in the food web, and they're eating the algae and eating the plants. And so in a pond, most of our primary consumers are things like zooplankton. So here we have a picture of a zooplankton. These float around, swim around in the water column eating phytoplankton. And then a lot of aquatic insects are also primary consumers. They eat plankton. They sometimes eat the detritus on the ground as well. The secondary consumers in the pond will eat these primary consumers. So these might be things like small fishes, tadpoles, and things like that. And basically, we just keep stepping up the food web from secondary consumers to tertiary consumers and things like that. And so this process of consumption is what allows energy to flow, comes into the pond from the sun and basically flows through everything in that food web. This might be a little bit too much detail, but what's interesting about this energy flow in a food web is that it's really inefficient. So if you have, you have this sunlight entering, only about 1% of that energy is actually used by the plants. And then every time something is eaten in the food web, only about 10% of that energy gets transferred. And so what that means is to grow a 1 pound bass, you need 10 pounds of bluegill. To grow 10 pounds of bluegill, you need 100 pounds of zooplankton. And to grow 100 pounds of zooplankton, you need 10,000 pounds of phytoplankton. And so when you take that energy and move it up through the food web to the things you're interested in, there's a lot of inefficiency there. And so that's why you typically need lots and lots of these small things to make a few of the larger things in your pond. Other consumers are things like mammals. So we'll get mammals and birds around our ponds. These can be great. These can be problematic depending on the situation. And like I've mentioned before, we also have these things in the pond that help us recycle some of the dead things in the pond. And so crayfish are great for that. Crayfish will help decompose some of the decaying matter in a pond, and then they can be eaten by things like bass. Bacteria are really important for this, and even some bottom feeders like catfish can be really important for recycling some of these dead organisms. So this is just a simplified diagram of what a pond ecosystem might look like. It's already starting to get a little complex with these arrows going everywhere, but basically what we have is we have nutrients down the bottom here. So the nutrients enter and then they're used by primary producers, plants and phytoplankton and algae. They're eaten then by the first level consumers like zooplankton, and then that then moves up the food web. You'll notice that some things will jump levels in the food web. So grass carp are actually a large fish that feed directly on plants. And then pretty much the only thing that might eat a grass carp might be a great blue heron. And so you can see that energy flow skips some of these levels in the food web. Yeah, so I think that's about it. And then you can see there are some things that don't really fit into the food web well, in the sense that they either decompose some dead organisms and help recycle some of that energy. And then some of these things, particularly the detritivores like mussels and crayfish, will then get eaten by some of these other parts of the food web. I guess the main thing to think about here is I always like to consider us people as part of the food web as well. Particularly if you're catching and eating fish out of your pond, then it's important to consider us as part of that food web process. Okay, I just want to talk now about a couple of biotic processes as the last part of this presentation. So predation is pretty straightforward. This is just animals eating each other. But it's actually one of the most important processes in a pond, particularly from a fish population standpoint. And that's because the number of predators you have out there can influence the number of prey. So the number of bass you have will influence your number of bluegill, because the more bass you have, the more bluegill get eaten. But on the flip side, the number of bluegill will also influence the number of bass that you have in your pond. And so it's really this balance between predators and prey that we try and manage when we trying to manage our fish. So if you have too many bluegill in your population, one way to fix that is allow more bass into your population to eat them. If you have too many bass, you might need to actually reduce your bluegill to try and kill off some of that bass population so that things get more in balance. And so in one of the upcoming series, when we talk about managing fish, we're going to focus a lot on things we can do to manipulate this predation process to keep things in balance and to get the outcomes that we want. Another important biotic process is competition. So basically, competition happens when organisms in the pond compete for food or space or other things with each other. Intra-specific competition is when this happens between organisms of the same species. So this might be, two bluegill competing for food. Interspecific competition is where this happens between different species. So this might be bass and bluegill competing for a certain area of the pond to build their nests and to spawn. In ponds, intra-specific competition is typically most important. And so this is the competition between individuals of the same species. If you get a lot of bluegill in your pond, they're all competing for food and for space. What happens is you can end up with bluegill that don't grow very large because there's not enough space and resources for all of them that are there. So if you have a pond where all of your bluegill seem to be 4 or 5 inches in size, typically what's happening is you have too many bluegill. and they're competing with each other for these resources. And so one way to encourage getting larger bluegill is to try and reduce the numbers of bluegill in your pond. You can do this by fishing and catching a lot of them, but the best way to do this is by introducing more predators. So if you have more bass in there, they'll eat a lot of these bluegill, resources will be freed up, and then some of the bluegill that survive can grow larger to the size that you might want them. One last thing I wanted to mention when I'm talking about these sort of biotic interactions is habitat, and we addressed some of this in the comments already. But habitat is important in ponds, and it's also highly diverse. And habitat can consist of both abiotic and biotic factors. So if you think about it, fish need certain temperature and oxygen and things like that to survive, and so that could be considered part of their habitat, and that would be part of their abiotic habitat. Other things that are part of the abiotic habitat are things like rocks and sand and wood and anything like that, because it's also not living. But then we also have living components of the habitat, and this is typically aquatic vegetation. And so, I get a lot of comments about people wanting to get rid of plants out of their pond, and in a lot of cases this is necessary. But aquatic vegetation is some of the best things that you can have in your pond to help fish production. And so healthy ponds really need a diversity of habitat and an abundance of good habitat. And so people ask me about putting habitat in their pond, what should they do, how much, how many? And really, you just want a good diversity of the habitat that's there. I want to reiterate that aquatic vegetation is really the gold standard of habitat. It provides fish shelter, it provides shade, it also provides food, because a lot of the invertebrates and insects and stuff like that live in that vegetation. It provides oxygen. And so really it's the best type of habitat you can have in your pond. You can also add habitat like these. You can see this person's adding some stake beds to their pond to provide some shelter and structure for fish to hang out around. Some fish will require specific habitat for reproduction. And so here you can see this is a cluster of bluegill beds. They typically need sandy or gravelly bottom to make these beds in them. Bass are the same way. And so if you want to promote sunfish or bass spawning, you might need to add some pea gravel or some sandy areas to your pond. Channel catfish like to reproduce inside like logs. And so you might need to add barrels or PVC pipe or something like that to help them reproduce. But I guess the important thing with habitat is habitat can do two different things. Some habitat will actually increase the production in your pond. So if you're adding habitat to help fish reproduce, then you're adding to that reproduction in your pond, and you're going to get more fish in your pond. And so that's increasing the production of your pond. However, a lot of habitat, particularly these artificial habitats that you might construct or buy, really a lot of this habitat just aggregates fish in a certain area, and it doesn't actually grow more fish into your pond. And this can be still good because, sometimes if you've got a larger pond, you might want to aggregate fish in certain areas to make them easier to catch. And so you might put some of these structures out there. But a lot of these things are not going to be increasing the production of fish in your pond. All right, so that's pretty much it, what I have for this presentation. I do want to just highlight that most of this information I presented and a whole bunch more is going to be coming out very soon in our new publication. So we have this new publication called More Than Just a Puddle, and it's focused on the pond ecosystem and the different components that we spoke about today. And in particular, it identifies how you can, why these factors are important for pond management. So this is still in draft format, but it should be live and published in the next couple of weeks. So I'll update you on that through this seminar series once that's out and you can get your hands on it. All right, that's it from the presentation. I look forward to answering some of your questions now and just having a general chat about the pond ecosystem.
Thank you, Mitch. That was great. I was looking forward to hearing this information. We don't typically talk a lot about ponds in our program, so this is great to hear. Very informative. So yes, I hope we can continue the conversation, and feel free to pose those questions. We have some coming in already. Mandy asked, how do you get rid of toxins such as blue-green algae?
Yeah, that's a good question. So So the blue-green algae, even though it's a bacteria, it can still be treated the same as you might treat other algae in your pond. And so most copper-based products will kill blue-green algae. You can use just copper sulfate, or sometimes it's more effective to use like a chelated copper product like Cutrine Plus. So these should kill off the cyanobacteria. I think the cyanobacteria blooms can be relatively short-lived, and so you might just try and wait them out if it's not too bad. But yeah, those products will kill off the blue-green algae, and then once those blue-green algae die, then those toxins will stop being produced and eventually sort of dissipate from the system.
So Sarah here asked about seeing windmills sold as ways to aerate. Is that the mechanism for aerating in this case?
So most aerator systems require some sort of power connection, power hookup. And you can use alternative means for power. You can use windmills, you can use solar. The tricky thing about aeration is that once you start your aerator in the spring, you typically want to leave that aerator running for the season, because if it stops, what happens is that stratification can start to set up, and then if you start it again, it will start mixing that low DO water in your pond and can actually start to cause some problems. So the best thing to do is to leave it running through the season. And if you're relying solely on solar power or wind power, sometimes if it's cloudy or there's no wind, you might not have the power to run that aeration system. And so most people have at least some power hookup, and then if they want to use alternative means, they can just use that power as a backup when there's no sun or something like that.
And Peg says, when you talked about aerators that bubble up, is that different from the fountain aerators that she sees in the suburban areas with retention ponds?
Yeah, so fountains are generally different, but there are fountains that will do a similar job. So most fountains that you see, they sit on the surface of the water, they suck water in from the surface and spray it up in the air. Number one, that uses a lot of energy, because if you had a handful of water and tried to throw it up in the air, it would take a lot of energy because gravity is working against you. So they typically use a lot of energy, and they're not really mixing the pond because they're just taking surface water, spraying it up, and then it sort of falls down at the surface. So most fountains are decorative and don't actually do much to move the water around. Some fountains are set up so that they actually suck water from deeper in the pond, pump it up, and then spray it in the water. These actually do a better job at circulating the water, but they still use a lot of energy. When you use a bubbler on the bottom, basically what happens is rather than trying to push water up into the sky, you're basically just allowing bubbles of air to flow up through your pond. And those bubbles don't actually add much oxygen to the water itself because it's not dissolved in the water. So what happens is those bubbles will push the water and cause that water to circulate. And so it's more about circulation than it is about adding oxygen. But because you're just bubbling air, and that air naturally wants to go up to the surface, they use a lot less power than a fountain would.
Great. I hope that helps, Peg. Then Tim says, we think we have some trapped gas that gets released periodically from possibly decaying leaves or sediment, I think is what he's saying. And then what's the best way to treat that? And that's actually related to another question we got earlier about tree leaves and pond impact from oak and walnuts.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And there are products that are sold that are marketed to say that they can, you add these products to the pond, whether they be enzymes or some sort of probiotic product that can help break down some of that leaf matter or things like that. They haven't really been tested a lot, scientifically tested a lot to determine how effective they are. Some people swear by them, some people are more skeptical of them. So that's one option you could look into. You might work with a professional or something to talk about that. But if you've got a lot of sediment, this sort of anoxic sediment that's releasing gas, or maybe you've got a lot of leaf matter, you may have to just try and physically sort of scoop some of that stuff out, either with a backhoe or something else. Because the leaves, leaves are similar to sediments in that they make your pond shallower and shallower. But as those leaves enter a pond, they also need to be decomposed by bacteria, and as the bacteria do that, they will be using oxygen. And so, a lot of ponds, particularly if they're surrounded by woodlands, will end up with a lot of leaf litter in the pond. Sometimes this can stain the pond a little bit, the color of the pond. That's not usually a big deal at all. But if you are getting a lot of leaf matter into your pond, you may have to periodically scoop some of it out to try and help that sort of breakdown process.
Great, thank you. And then Mandy mentions that she has a friend that added lime and fertilizer to the bottom before he built a pond, and that you had mentioned that Midwest soil is already pretty high in nutrients. So would it be more harmful to add nutrients? In most cases, yeah. I would say in 99% of the cases, there are enough nutrients going into ponds to promote, production. There are some cases where that's not the case, though. If you've ever been to like a strip pit pond or an old quarry, often those ponds are really, really clear. You might see down 20, 25 feet into the water column, and they have very low production. And so if you have something like that, or you have a, like a natural spring-fed pond that doesn't have a lot of runoff bringing nutrients in, if you have, very clear water, then you might have low nutrients and low production. And so in those cases, you might look to add fertilizers to sort of promote some of that production. I always tell people to be really cautious with that, and it's definitely best to work with a professional so they can assess your pond first, and they can monitor it throughout the process to make sure you're not going to over fertilize and potentially cause issues with plants and stuff like that. And related, and I know this is another topic you and I have spoken about, Mitch, but Jessica mentions, can you speak a little bit about site selection for developing a pond and those things that you look for to see if it's a viable habitat option? Yeah, that's a good question. I've never built a pond from scratch, so but I've spoken to some of the NRCS folks that do a lot with construction and pond maintenance and stuff like that. And there are lots of different things to consider when you're building a pond. You want the soil to be able to hold water. And so you can actually go and access a soils map for your property and see what soil types you have on your property to help you select the site for the pond. So the soil type's important for holding water. You also want water to flow. If your pond is not spring fed or creek fed, you want it to flow in off the land. And so you want to have some land draining into your pond. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a pond that dries up a lot. But if you have a really large area that flows into your pond, you could end up with excessive sediment and excessive nutrients. And so that's just something to think about as well. And then in terms of building a new pond, if you have a gully or a small stream or something, you can do things by, damming that up to create your pond. And there are some definite considerations when building a dam. Or if you've got a fairly, flat area, you might just actually excavate an area that will fill in through running off the land. So there are lots of things to think about with pond construction. I would say that the Natural Resources Conservation Service is a great resource for construction. They will help you plan it out. Sometimes you can get financial assistance for building ponds too. So definitely reach out to them or your local soil and water conservation district office to get some more information about pond construction. And Mitch, you have information about pond construction links on your site as well. Is that true? That's right. Yeah, we link to it. There's a great handbook put out by the NRCS that talks all about pond construction and stuff. So you can definitely you can download that for free from our website. There's also a checklist there that we encourage people to do on their existing ponds to once a year, once every other year, do like a maintenance checklist to make sure your dam's not going to fail. But then we also have our county contact page there where you can actually find the NRCS or Soil and Water Conservation
district office in your county and reach out to them about getting help with pond construction.
And pond management is actually going to be our topic next week. So that's a little plug there. So also we have a question, what about adding a chemical like sonar or reward to keep pond free of invasive pondweed year round?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There's definitely a place for herbicides with managing aquatic plants. The last workshop for this series, we're going to focus on aquatic plant management, and chemicals are a tool that we can use to do that. And I always think of using chemicals and using herbicides are just one tool that we have to help manage plants. And so you could do things where it may be that you can prevent nutrients coming in or other things like that to minimize the growth of those, to help reduce the amount of chemicals you need to use. But definitely if you have an invasive species in your pond, then that's something you might want to manage with chemicals. It's pretty hard to completely get rid of something. You might just be able to keep it at lower levels. But if you do know that you've got an invasive or a problematic species in your pond, then definitely take care if you're moving equipment or boots or whatever to other people's properties, that you don't sort of transfer that plant over to someone else's pond. But generally, using chemicals is a good way to, it's like using a herbicide on your lawn. You want to just keep stuff in check. Don't leave it get completely out of control and kill it off all at once, because that'll cause problems with your pond. But if you can keep on top of it by adding small applications, then that's definitely a feasible option. I always just tell people that if you can find alternative ways to minimize the amount of chemical you have to use, then not only are you adding less chemicals to your pond, but you're also spending less money on those chemicals. So
sounds good. Peg says some pond companies are marketing something just extra to specifically eliminate phosphorus. It sounded experimental when I tried to research it online, and it's expensive. They say other treatments treat for phosphorus, but don't eliminate what's already present. Can you talk about this a little bit, please? And it does relate maybe more to suburban retention ponds.
Yeah, I actually don't know much at all about those products, and I'd be more than happy to do a bit of research on them if you wanted to send me an email or whatever. I do know that typically once you have nutrients and other things for that matter in your pond, it's difficult to get rid of them. With sediment, you might have to scoop it out, and with nutrients, you might just have to allow them to run their course until you can prevent new ones coming in. But yeah, those products, I would definitely say they're probably experimental and probably haven't been tested scientifically, by the scientific community much. Definitely be wary of companies that are promoting some of these products and stuff like that. But also, a lot of these products might be feasible and might have validity too. And so I'll be more than happy to do some research. If you were to send me an email with a link or something like that, I can follow that up and get back to you.
And Peg, also you asked about the webinar being recorded. It will be, and we'll share that, and we'll also provide the links. And the email that I send to you all as a follow-up will have Mitch's email in it as well. And his email address is at the beginning of the presentation. And actually, we also have Angela on the line here, or with us on the webinar, who's with NRCS, and she mentions NRCS only helps financially for ponds when using them from livestock watering, but they're happy to help with site locations and construction information in addition to that. But that leads to something I wanted to ask Mitch about using ponds for livestock. And are many people still using ponds for direct watering of livestock? Or I know maybe it's better practices to be using the pond as a source of water and watering somewhere else, but what kind of issues are there surrounding using ponds specifically for livestock watering?
Yeah, so I can't really speak to how much it's being used. I do know that if you we'll talk about this in the next seminar, but like understanding your goals for a pond is really important. And sometimes if you have multiple goals, it can be pretty tricky to balance them. So if you're watering livestock in your pond, typically what happens is they disturb the sediments when they walk in the pond, right? And so they can trample and prevent vegetation growing in the pond, but they can also cause your pond to be muddy. And so that can cause issues if you also want to have your pond as a nice, clear swimming area that, if you want to water your livestock and swim in your pond, that can be a sort of a conflicting goals there. If people have larger ponds, typically what we say is if they can restrict the livestock watering to a certain area so that, that area might get muddy and the plants might get trampled down, but the rest of the pond can still maintain good habitat. But yeah, I imagine a lot of people probably use the water from ponds to water their livestock, but they don't allow their livestock direct access. I will say that, with pretty much all the chemicals that you might use in a pond for plants and stuff like that, read the labels very carefully, because there's often restrictions when it comes to livestock or using that water to irrigate your crops as well. So if you are using some of these products, read the label very carefully, and there might be some restrictions you need to consider when it comes to livestock and irrigation.
Great, thank you. And we've actually had several questions about cattails, some in advance of the call, but they all tie in sort of to what Jody is asking now about how much cattail is too much cattail. She has this coming in on a relatively new pond, 2 years old, and she's a little concerned. She's always equated cattails with nutrient enrichment, and she knows it's native, but I think the question is how much is too much?
Yeah, cattails are really interesting because they're a great emergent vegetation for providing a buffer strip and collecting nutrients and sediment for us. They can provide habitat to juvenile fishes when they're small, but they prevent access to it for us to get to the pond, and they can really grow out of control pretty quickly. And so the question of how much cattail is too much is really, how much access do you need to the pond? Because the cattail is going to grow as much as it can, and it prefers that sort of shallow, slow tapering area. It can really fill in those spaces. And the other thing is that cattails are really tricky to treat and to deal with too, because they have the plants that are growing above the soil, they have the seeds, but they also have these complex roots that if you cut them off at the soil, then those roots will just grow new plants. And so I would say that if you have a new pond and you're starting to get cattails show up, then if you want to restrict them to a certain area, then I would work hard and be quite aggressive to keep them contained in the area you want, because if you leave them go for a year or two, they will expand out of that and become quite tricky to manage. A lot of people try and mechanically remove them, and that can take a lot of work, and you've got to get the root systems out as well. If you want to chemically treat cattails, you can use an aquatic version of glyphosate that can help treat those, and it's best to do so. You can do it in the spring and the fall, but the fall is really important because what happens in the fall is these cattails start to store energy for the winter, and if you treat them with the chemical, then they really take that energy in, and you can kill off some of the roots and the plants and everything as well. So yeah, cattails are a tricky one, and they have a lot of pros, but they have a lot of cons as well. So I would say that you're at the right time to be asking questions, because if you want to manage them or restrict them, you need to sort of be quite aggressive with that.
Yeah, it sounds very similar to some of the terrestrial species too. Fall's a good time because they're pulling back. And Jessica also, again, reminder, Jessica is a DNR biologist on the call with us. And Jessica, you're welcome to unmute yourself if you like, and share this too. But as she mentioned that there are both native and invasive, there's some that are native and some that are invasive. And they're difficult to tell apart, and they could hybridize. And as she said, any public lakes, cattails cannot be removed without proper permits. So that's another note. Jessica, do you have anything you'd like to share or add on to what Mitch has said? No, she got it covered. Well, I don't see any more questions in the actual chat box. Oh, I have unmuted. Actually, I've allowed everyone now, we're getting toward the end. I've allowed everyone to unmute themselves. So if you would like to ask a question yourself, go ahead and unmute yourself. Jessica, I'm going to ask you to unmute if you can. Okay, there you go.
I got it.
Good.
No, oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, I thought Dr. and I'm not going to try, did a great job. So thank you very much. And just, we do have district biologists here as different resources depending on what you're looking to do. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And if they don't know, they should be able to point you in the right direction.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I will say that on our website, the Find Your County contact page, we have district biologists on there. We have a whole bunch of people, and that's a great place to go. Even if, I know there's a lot of turnover in some of those positions. And so even if it's not the right person anymore, that should give you a place to start to find somebody who's local to you that can help.
We have a few more minutes and we have a few more questions. Mandy said, we're looking at building a pond in a rural setting. We want it to be a big enough pond for us to do fishing, specifically growing big bass, and possibly some recreational activities, but we also want to make it manageable. Any recommendations on how many acres? And also, before you ask that, someone else asked, what's the ideal size for a pond farm for fishing strictly bass and bluegill for management?
Yeah, so, definitely, ponds are a little bit like fish tanks. And if anybody's ever kept fish tanks, the smaller the fish tank you have, the trickier it is to keep things in balance and everything like that. And so, often ponds less than an acre in size can be a little tricky to manage because, there's just there's smaller space and things. Once something gets out of whack, it can sort of take over really quickly, and then you sort of counteract that, and you're always fighting to get this balance. And so, I know there are a lot of people have successful ponds that are less than an acre in size, but if you have the ability to make it at least an acre, then that can provide you with some more stability when you're managing, but also the opportunity to have a few different species of fish in there to provide some diversity when you're fishing. Obviously, the larger your pond, the more money it takes to add chemicals or maybe add aerators and stuff like that. And so there's a lot of things to think about, and obviously larger ponds take more to construct too. If you have a smaller pond or you're looking to build a smaller pond, quarter acre, half acre in size, sometimes what you can do is just restrict the number of species you have in that pond. So sometimes if you just have bass and bluegill, you can create a sort of balanced fish community in those smaller ponds. Or some people, when they have really small ponds, will just put catfish in there, and then they'll feed those catfish pellets, and they'll use that as sort of like as like a put and take sort of fishery. They put the catfish in, they feed them up, you can catch them for fun, and you can also take them out and eat them. And the great thing about having just one species in a pond is you don't have to try and manage that predator-prey interaction that I mentioned today. So, but in terms of an ideal size, I think if it's within your means and your willingness to work on a pond that's about an acre in size, that's a great starting point if you've got the space.
That sounds good. Okay. Another question, Jody is asking, do I have to worry about the aquatic life with the aquatic glyphosate?
That's a good question. I can't remember off the top of my head if what the sort of concerns or restrictions are for aquatic glyphosate. You definitely want to make sure you use the form that's approved for aquatic use, because the surfactant that's in the regular Roundup will kill your fish and other things in your pond. But if you use the glyphosate that's approved for aquatic use, then it's much safer for the things that are in your pond. But regardless of what chemical you're using, make sure you read the label. And we're actually working on some publications now about plants and aquatic herbicides and stuff like that we'll have out here soonish. But I can't remember the restrictions and things like that off the top of my head. But generally, it's safe for the fish that you're interested in, for sure.
And I know you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but or you showed a picture of at least the blue-green algae, but someone is asking, how do you identify toxic algae? Is there like overall characteristic to be able to say this is a problem versus something that's a little more benign?
Yeah, so blue-green algae, it's sometimes easy to tell blue-green algae apart from regular filamentous algae because filamentous algae tends to be that duller green color. And the other thing is that blue-green algae will float and cause these like surface scums. But in terms of differentiating between different types of blue-green algae or even blue-green algae and other microscopic regular green algae, it can be really tricky and you've really got to use a microscope. And so some places, some consultancies and other places, you can send them a sample and they'll be able to identify it for you. They can also test whether or not it's toxin producing. We actually recently interviewed an aquatic ecotoxicologist on our podcast, and the whole episode was about harmful algae. And she talks a lot about the characteristics of blue-green algae and why it's harmful and how it changes and stuff like that. And so if you're interested in that, then definitely check out that podcast episode.
That's excellent. Someone else asked, they have an interest in swimming ponds. Mm-hmm. Is there things that you would recommend in particular to think about if that's one of your primary objectives?
Yeah, so if you're interested in swimming predominantly, then ideally you probably want to minimize the plant growth as much as you can. And so depending on the size, if you're building it or you have the ability to drain it, sometimes you can do things like put plastic liners on the pond so that it prevents plant from growing. Other things that people will do, for a swimming pond is they might be more open to adding some of the blue dyes to help prevent plants growing. And so, most of the time what I see is if people want to predominantly swim in their pond, they don't want it choked out with plants and, they may not, plants are great for fish, but if they don't care too much about fish, then you want to try and restrict some of those plants. And it's best to do so with some of these sort of prevention measures, because once you start adding chemical herbicides, then there may be restrictions in terms of how, when you can use it and when you can swim. So, So yeah, you can use other things like rocky riprap along the shoreline to prevent, the plants having a place to grow too. So that's often what I see in swimming ponds is things, doing everything you can to prevent a lot of that plant material from growing.
Wonderful. Well, are there any other questions from the group that's here? Anything else anyone wants to put in the chat box, or you're welcome to unmute yourself now if you have anything you'd like to share. Well, if not, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Dr. Mitch. It was fascinating. We look forward to the next 3 episodes in our series, what should I say? And again, we will follow up with all of these links and some of the resources we talked about today. And it's not too late to sign up for the next 3 sessions. So thank you very much. And we hope to see you soon next week. Next week will be management plans and monitoring plans.
Great. Thanks, everybody.